I've come to talk about something called the gig economy. So back in 2016, I was trying to think of an idea for a book. And if we think back like 4 or 5 years, there was a lot in the news at the time about how the economy was, there were a record number of people in work. The economy was well on the way to recovery after the 2008 recession. Yet behind the scenes, if we looked more closely, something more disconcerting was going on. There was a big rise in the number of people on things called 0 hours contracts, where you had no guaranteed hours each week. There was something called, this phrase I kept hearing, the gig economy, which summoned up, it sounds very glamorous, the gig economy. Almost like summons up this kind of glamorous image of kind of rock stardom. You turn up to a gig when you want. You have freedom, you have flexibility, you have autonomy. You are your own boss. So I kept seeing adverts for things like companies such as Uber and Deliveroo, where it would say, come and get a job with us and be your own boss. So, I mean, I wanted to find out what, whether this kind of, this imagery the companies presented corresponded to the reality. So I set out in 2016 for 6 months to work in this section of the economy, to go undercover, as it were, and find out what the reality of life was like in the gig economy. The first company I worked for, in this kind of area, I worked for Amazon, which is a company I'd used myself, of course. I imagine we've all pretty much used Amazon at some point. I got a job in an Amazon warehouse in the town of Rugeley in the West Midlands. And I was on it was a temporary job, so a 9-month job. This was all the contracts that they offered. It was a 0 hours contract. And upon joining the company, upon getting the job, I first encountered some of the vocabulary that's very popular in the gig economy. So I got a job in this warehouse, this Amazon warehouse, and we were told on our first day that we weren't allowed to call it a warehouse at all. We had to call it a fulfillment center. We were also told that we weren't allowed to refer to each other as workers or managers or bosses, but we were all associates. So we were told that Jeff Bezos is an associate, and so are you. We are all one big happy family at Amazon. Never mind that Jeff Bezos, in an average day, we'd earn about 30, 40 pounds, whereas Jeff Bezos' share price would maybe go up by several million. We're all one big happy family. We're all associates. We also, to get the job at Amazon, we also had to be drug and alcohol tested, which I'd never had to do in any job before, which as a journalist is probably lucky because, well, I probably won't expand on that anymore. But there were also cardboard cutouts around the warehouse of supposed Amazon workers with speech bubbles coming from their heads saying things like, "We love coming to work, we miss it when we're not here." North Korea style. But this kind of rhetorical universe, if you like, this kind of language we were bombarded with, it didn't correspond with the reality of the job, perhaps unsurprisingly. So, as an Amazon worker, you received, if you received 6 disciplinary points, you'd lose your job. And you receive these points for minor infractions of company policy. So if you took a day off sick, even with a letter from the doctor, you receive a disciplinary point. If you took too long going to the bathroom, this would be referred to as idle time, and you would receive a disciplinary point. One time, the coach bringing workers to work, it broke down, so everyone was 5 minutes late clocking in, and everyone received a disciplinary point for this as well. So it was very easy to lose your job, and yeah, it didn't correspond with kind of the promises of the so-called gig economy. There were also massive issues with underpayment. So one girl I interviewed who was working at Amazon was paid 62 pence an hour by one of the employment agencies, and it took her 6 weeks to get the money back from the employer, and it was over Christmas. And she told me that if she hadn't she'd had to move back in with her mother, and she told me if that hadn't been possible, she would have been made homeless essentially. You had to pass through giant airport-style security every time you went in and out of work because you were under constant suspicion that you were going to steal things. And this was the biggest employer in this English town. So it created this great deal of resentment in the town. And it was probably one of the worst places I've ever worked. And it was a level of exploitation I'd never seen before. Some of the most vulnerable people, it was mainly migrant workers, some of the most vulnerable people in our society, being treated like this by the biggest multinational in the world, headed by the richest individual in the world. And it's something that I didn't feel like people really knew. It really shocked me, to put it bluntly. The most kind of striking thing I saw while I was working at Amazon, and it became a bit of a meme after this, was one afternoon, I was doing my job at Amazon, which was an order picker, where you pick the orders off the shelf put them in baskets, put them on a conveyor belt, and then send them on their way for the Amazon delivery drivers. I stumbled across a Coke bottle which was half filled with urine, which was on the shelf amongst all the miscellanea of Amazon's goods. And it was there because someone had been so afraid to go to the toilet because people were being punished for this, that people had started to urinate into Coke bottles and the like because they were terrified of losing their job if they used the bathroom on the job. Another company I worked for, that was the Amazon experience. So if you buy my book after this, maybe don't use Amazon to do it. Another company, I worked for 3 months for Uber as an Uber driver. That was in London. And Uber's probably the company that's most associated with the gig economy and being your own boss. So my onboarding session, which is like your induction to be an Uber driver, I turned up on the job and was greeted by this kind of hip character in a jeans and t-shirt, a kind of bro, like a tech bro, if you like, with a beard and whatever, very matey, trying to be my friend, even though he's kind of my boss. And he told us, he explained to us, we were here to make money as an Uber driver. You're an independent business person now, he said. He came out with all this stuff, freedom, flexibility, autonomy. But and for this kind of freedom and flexibility, being our own boss, what we'd sacrificed is our right to a minimum wage, our right to holiday pay, and our right to sick pay, because we were now independent contractors. We were now freedom fighters in this new economy. But it didn't, were we really our own boss? I drove for Uber for 3 months, and we were told on this induction day, we were told that, you can't pick and choose what jobs you do. So whatever job Uber sends you, you have to do that, which didn't really feel like self-employment. If you're a plumber or something and there's a job 100 miles away and it's not worth your while to go and do that job, you're free to turn it down. But with Uber, you didn't have that freedom. You were told that any job they send you, you have to do it. We were even told what subjects we could talk about with the passenger in the back of our car. So we were told that we were not allowed, under any circumstances, to talk about politics, religion, or sport, which, as a taxi driver, what the hell else are you supposed to talk about? So it didn't feel like the person in the back of your car was your customer. It felt like they were Uber's customer. For those of you who've used Uber, there's like a star rating system where you order your Uber through your smartphone. You go on your journey, then it asks you to rate the driver between 1 and 5 stars. And if your rating as a driver fell below 4.7 stars on average, you would be brought into the office and potentially deactivated, as they called it, which, fired. This reminded me of Amazon as well, where if you lost your job, you weren't sacked or fired, you were released. Or as we used to joke, you'd actually been promoted to the role of a customer. But it was, I mean, the Uber experience, what happened is you weren't your own boss. What it was, this model was a ruse to kind of offload business risk from the company onto you as a worker. So you were very tightly controlled by Uber. Friends of mine who I made friends with and interviewed for my book, who worked for Deliveroo and other courier companies like this, it was a very similar experience. They'd sacrificed their workers' rights, which had been fought for by generations before them, their right to holiday pay, their right to sick pay if they got ill, and their right to a minimum wage. They sacrificed these things on the promise of freedom and flexibility. And the only freedom and flexibility we really had in the gig economy was the freedom to turn our phone off. So there was that. I mean, you didn't have a boss who was in your ear all the time. You could turn your phone off if you didn't want to work, but then you wouldn't make any money. When you were actually working for the companies, you were very tightly controlled. So Uber's kind of its MO, if you were, as it were, was I remember when Uber first came on the scene, they said they wanted to make transportation as reliable as running water. And so what did they mean by this? They mean, so, if you turn on the tap, you don't want to wait 10 minutes for the water to come out. It's there at all times. It's there at all times. Like the electricity grid or something. You turn the light switch on, it's always there. The traditional model of say, transportation is you stand out on the street waving your arm in the rain, especially in Manchester, and you wait 10 minutes for a cab to stop and pick you up. But Uber wants this kind of network effect where you turn your phone on, and at all times there's like a fleet of taxis driving around all the time, so you turn your phone on, you order an Uber, and it's there immediately, which from a customer's perspective is great. But who pays for that? Who pays for that network effect? Who pays for that fleet of drivers swarming around the city at all times? Now, in a traditional business model, say in a shop or something, as a worker, you don't only get paid when someone comes into the shop. You get paid an hourly rate. You get paid a minimum wage, and you have safeguards. The Uber model means that you only get paid when a passenger is in the back of your car. The rest of the time, you're paying for the business yourself. When you're driving around the city, it's your petrol money that you're spending. It's your time that you're accruing. So you're carrying the risk of the business. You're carrying a big part of the business risk for companies like Uber. This is much more radical than it sounds like initially. This is much more radical than I think many people have realized. This offloading of business risk back onto the worker, but also onto the taxpayer. Because Deliveroo couriers, bicycle couriers I interviewed, this is a very arduous job, cycling around all the time, making these deliveries. And sometimes they get injured. So I remember I interviewed one Deliveroo courier, and he injured ligaments in his arm, so he couldn't work for a period of about a month, I think. And normally a company would pay you sick pay for this. But with this gig economy model, he had to sign on for housing benefit during this time because he had no income. So the taxpayer was picking up the tab for this company as well. So it's the worker and the taxpayer picking up the tab for this, which is, again, this is quite revolutionary. And this model of work is spreading. So I kind of wanted to kind of leave you with this. For those of us who don't work as in an Amazon warehouse or in kind of as a courier for like a food for Uber Eats or as an Uber driver or for Deliveroo or whatever, it's easy to just kind of shrug our shoulders and just see the benefit of this as a consumer. But this kind of model of work is spreading. As a journalist, I now work to some extent as a freelance journalist in the gig economy. I don't have holiday pay and sick pay anymore. My employment conditions are much more precarious. And if we don't nip some of this stuff in the bud, if we don't take a concern for, first of all, a moral concern for the people who are being forced to urinate into bottles when they're working for the biggest company and the richest company in the world, that's a moral issue. But it's also an issue of self-interest, a pragmatic issue. If we don't nip these conditions in the bud, this type of work is spreading. And one day we could wake up to find that all of us have lost our employment rights. So this is why I'd say that it's important for all of us to fight for workers in the gig economy and to see through some of this euphemistic bullshit that they put out there, and let's defend some of the most vulnerable people in our economy. Thank you very much.